My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
As is the title of this series, La Canoa is a part of La Canoa is a part of Acequia infrastructure, and it's really important that we see that there's probably we're not certain how many acequias there are. We have to ask Paula, who's going to be collaborating with me in this talk, and I'm so glad that she's the director of the New Mexico Acequia Association, and who I think is the heir apparent of La Academia, and because she worked with many of these people for quite a bit of time, and still works with many of the people of La Academia. And so through her work in the New Mexico Acequia Association, it's an honor to have her present with me today. And but I wanted to start off talking about La Canoa, and in terms of thinking about, we kind of guesstimate there's probably more than 500 acequias in the state, and just like how Tomás Atencio often would say, is like every community has its church, every community has its campana, but every campana, cada campana suena diferente. No, every community has its individuality, and it's what makes it its own. And so today I wanted to sing a song to honor a lot of the acequia leaders who have worked so hard to keep the water running through our communities, bringing that life force. And I'm going to start off with a song that has become. We started singing this song probably about 10 years ago, and I've sung it for so many meetings, and it really means a lot that people ask for us to come sing this song once in. And it starts off. Ya viene amaneciendo, yo sigo trabajando para mantener lo que yo quiero tanto. And it's on the blue flyer. And this song was a collaborative effort between me, Cipriano Vigil, and Roger Montoya. It was a project that we did back in, I think it was 2011. We were working with the Española Moving People dance company. We did an acequia dance, an acequia cleaning with the youth. And so they choreographed the cleaning of the acequia, and this was the song that we used as they danced, and so it's a song that it honors the people that have worked hard on the acequia. It's a song to the people that wake up before the sun comes out, and oftentimes those same people are the ones working on these communities when the sun goes down. And the people who bring us our food, they're may God bless them, and they're probably the most important people in our community. And I sing this song for them. And so I'm going to start off today with this, but I'll get more into what La Canoa means in different places, and also what exactly we mean by acequia Resolanas. Okay, but I'll start off today with this song. Ya viene amaneciendo, yo sigo trabajando para mantener lo que yo quiero tanto. Ya viene amaneciendo, yo sigo trabajando para mantener lo que yo quiero tanto, para mantener lo que yo quiero tanto. Ya vamos a la acequia, a la acequia van todos, agarra ya la pala para limpiar el bordo, agarra ya la pala para limpiar el bordo. We're going to go to the last verse, or the second to the last verse. Ya brillan las estrellas sobre la nieve fría, todita el agua que caiga, todita sea bendita, todita el agua que caiga, todita sea bendita. La noche está llegando, yo sigo trabajando para mantener lo que yo quiero tanto, para mantener lo que yo quiero tanto. A ver, can you guys help me out? Para mantener lo que yo quiero tanto. Thank you. So I wanted to start off, thank you once again. Siempre pues es importante, pues yo soy David García, vengo de una comunidad del norte de Nuevo México que se llama El Huache. Gracias por prestarme la palabra aquí en este lindo lugar, en este lindo día. I wanted to start off to say, the guitar and how it's in many ways been one of the most critical instruments to my investigation of doing work on the acequias. A lot of times people say, oh, maybe it's your tape recorder, people taking your camera. For me, it's been the guitar because I've often been, as an anthropologist and a musician as well, I've often been asked to bring music to these communities, and I'm thankful that I've had such a great compañera en la investigación. No, the guitar has been a really good companion in terms of doing work, and it's in many ways it's a practice of doing anthropology. I don't do anthropology normally as a lot of people do anthropology. Typically, New Mexico has had a long history of anthropology, and I've often have thought, maybe what I'm doing is not anthropology. And I've talked to other anthropologists recently. We collaborated on a piece. It's called the Laboratory of Anthropology. It was a piece that was recently published by the Association of Anthropologists in Anthropology News. It's called our Laboratory of Anthropology, and that's often the sense is some of the traditions of a particular discipline of looking at cultural others. For me, growing up in northern New Mexico has been often foreign. It's a foreign discipline. And so I wanted to kind of describe, what anthropologura is to me. And one of the people that has been critical to help me to talk about this, her name is Amy Villarreal, Dr. Amy Villarreal, who's at Our Lady of the Lake University. at Olu in San Antonio. And we've come up with this definition of antropolocura. And it's antropolocura, the combination of anthropos and locura. Anthropos is human beings, no? And locura is it borders on madness, no? And so is a combination of critical discovery, scientific, collective, and personal. It thrives on the stuff your professors warned you about. It's personal enmeshment, family ties, durable community commitment, challenging emotional work, and unsettling ethical dilemmas. Antropolocura is insurgent, it's unruly, it's adhering. I often told Amy, insurgent, what does that mean? It's revolting. No. It adheres to alternative realities. It's radical forms of dialogue and codes of respect. It's a borderlandia steeped in the interdisciplinary incarnate. And so in many ways, that's a really key point, is that in terms of understanding antropolocura, it's interested in documenting these knowledges, but it's also interested in putting them into praxis, putting them into work, making them part of our everyday lived experience. And so its locuras, or we call them, theories, emerge from homework as opposed to fieldwork. Typically, anthropologists did fieldwork in a foreign land to understand those people. But when you come from a community, sometimes being in a community doesn't automatically give you access to various communities within that community. But one of the things that's important is that there's a notion of homework rather than fieldwork. As a hometown ethnographer, these methodologies derive from, sometimes from ethnic studies, the study of subjugated other knowledges. And at its heart of it, antropolocura is something we call decolonial sanación. We think about nuestra esperanza is that the work of antropolocura es una antropolocura que cura. Thinking about what's different from fieldwork to homework is that often we think fieldwork is there's not really an engagement, a tie to that sort of work. We call upon Kamala Visvanvaran's work in her book Feminist Engagement, that she calls homework as opposed to fieldwork is a work that builds home. And so in many ways we take these sorts of keys about these cues that this antropolocura is perhaps a way that we can make somewhat understanding of the field of anthropology. I often say, people say, are you an anthropologist? I would say it's a very difficult question for me to define myself as an anthropologist. As a músico, it's very easy for me to define myself as a músico. And so in many ways, typically anthropology has been criticized for the colonial practices of appropriating various cultural resources and documenting them, and they stay stagnant in libraries, often alienated from the communities in which they were taken from. And so I want to talk quickly about what Resolana is now. And just like I said, in terms of how many different, the different sounds of different church bells, that's how many different Resolanas. My primary work in this dissertation work that's looking towards seeing how we can document this in a form. I'm not sure if it's going to be a book or what it's going to be. But in terms of thinking about Resolanas, is that there's as many Resolanas as there are, different sounds of church bells. So typically, a Resolana, is thought of as the southern-facing wall of a building. It's a microclimate of warmth, especially now during these winter months. It's kind of. They asked me if I want to do this talk earlier on in the fall, And I said, no, the right time for Resolana is right now. It's when you're looking for those walls that para repechar el viento, to basically find a place to find a place where one can protect themselves from the elements of the wind and the cold. And so my work does often people ask, well, what does your work do? Do you just look up definitions of Resolana, what people give you? And I call my dissertation project, it was a tracing the communicative cartographies of Resolana. And I think, in many ways, tracing was a word that I was best able to kind of to talk about it in terms of that often, people want to know, where is it mapped out? Where can I find Resolana? And sometimes the Resolana is a sense, it's something ephemeral. It moves with the sun. It's constantly changing throughout the year. And in many ways, my work looks at, if anybody was attending I gave a talk in the fall that was called Phantom Publics, which looked at Resolana in New Mexico from the 1880s to the 1940s, in which public practices in plazas were often denigrated. People were often looked, highly thought of. They were suspect in plaza spaces, and it was a time in New Mexico where a lot of plaza spaces were being challenged for who could be in those plaza spaces. This is followed up in the work of Silvia Rodriguez, who talks about how the Plaza of Taos is a culturally contested place, as is Las Vegas and many of the other spaces. Later on, the work of Livia Romero looks at how Resolanas emerged in a lot of commercial areas, such as the Walmarts and Walmart snack bars inside in parcaderos along the community highways where people would park their cars. And then the later chapters looked at a radical change in terms of politicizing what Resolanas were in the 1970s when Tomás Atencio and others from the Academia de la Nueva Raza reimagined the term Resolana to be a way of for communities to create spaces and also create ways of documenting what was going on, but often it was also a way for communities to empower communities to basically form better forms of communication and affirm cultural resources before they were being as they were being challenged in the 1970s. And so today's talk is looking at how the work that has been done on acequias since the 1970s has really taken on the ideas of Academia de la Nueva Raza. Their idea of Resolana was often it was a Resolana that was thought of to be not just simply dialogue, but it was what Tomás Atencio calls a spiral of thought and action. It was a process, a methodology for social change. So many of the terms that the acequia adapted in the 1980s and 90s and today are close tied with the formulations that Academia did in the 1970s. And so that's what I want to talk about today in terms of how social movements are utilizing these ideas of Resolana. And so I'll quickly go into some of what I've written about acequias, because also there's also other forms of Resolanas and acequias in which I'll talk about. Okay, I'll start off today and saying talking about acequias in the canoa. As the canoa is a part of the infrastructure of acequias, so are Resolanas in terms of its cultural legacy. Like we often look at, often we tend to look at like what is we have to go often repair acequia infrastructure on a yearly basis. Sometimes if there's floods, we have to do quick maintenance. But what in terms do we look at of structures, whether it be structures that we just basically feel, such as what are the structures, cultural structures or cultural infrastructure of ways of talking and ways of being in acequia communities? How in many ways do those also need to be maintained? And what sorts of shifts and dynamics do those sorts of spaces encounter? I'll start off. One of the main forms of infrastructure in New Mexico are the 1,000 miles of gravity-fed irrigation canals called acequias. These primarily earthen hydraulic systems are expansions of older Pueblo Indian forms of irrigation. During the Spanish colonial period and Mexican period, acequias proliferated to provide water service to a growing population that relied on locally grown food and livestock raising. As aerial photos attest, acequias extend the riparian zones that are formed along the rivers, creating complex ecological greenbelts of agricultural lands. Many of these lands are private properties, usually thin strips that average on 6 to 7 acres that are called suertes. These are serviced by communal acequia irrigation systems. Along with acequias, the historic forms of land settlement that are found in New Mexico and southern Colorado differ from more industrial and agricultural found in the southern part of New Mexico and surrounding states. Apart from the physical canals, acequias are communities of interest that form associations that are recognized as political subdivisions of the state. They are second only to Native American governments as the oldest forms of government in the state, with some of the earliest associations forming in the 17th century. Today's talk will show how Resolana matters to acequia communities as a traditional gathering space, as a place of governance, and as a metaphor for organizing. I also will show how Resolana functions as a space for networking, not only locally, but also regionally and globally. People who utilize these spaces mediate hegemonic forms of democracy, water management to create these networks. Taking into account the significance of language performance and space, I will show how Resolana structures the local ethnopoetics of governance of acequias in New Mexico. This will be done through analyzing autoethnographic and ethnographic narratives, as well as my continuing work with the nonprofit organization, the Mexico Acequia Association, which promotes the interests of acequias statewide and nationally. And so in terms of talking about the NMAA, it's a nonprofit organization. This is work that is primarily collaborative. And I want to recognize Paula García, who was able to come today, and she's going to be speaking about, not only the work of the Escuelita de Las Acequias, which I'll talk about, but more so the grander plan for acequia movements in New Mexico and what's the future of those. As a lot of times we see, global change is putting a lot of pressure in terms of what's going to happen in our communities. That's why the reason that these topics and these movements are right on the pulse of our state. They're important topics for study, and also they're important topics for advocacy and for movement building and changing hearts and minds, as Paula often says. In terms of building a greater base for people to know the importance of growing our own food, having healthy communities, and having a space where the acequia is not only just a resource, but as the statement often says, it's a source of life. And Paula will speak in a bit after I get through a couple of things to start off with. And so I'm going to start off how I got interested in the acequia and what my personal ties to the acequia are. Growing up in Rio Arriba, I'm from the community of El Huache. I was intimately familiar with the acequia that ran through my family's apple orchard and livestock pasture. Surrounding the actual canal is a litany of specialized terms in Spanish. As I would listen to how people would speak over a lifetime, slowly started to unravel the linguistic infrastructure and ways of speaking that constitute this cultural significance of the acequia. I also want to say, who here Who here is part of an Acequia community? So I won't have to, so we have people from Acequia communities. We also have Acequia scholars here and Acequia activists, and so I also don't want to be preaching to the choir, because I know there's a lot of people that I've learned a lot from. So I said, as a young man, I did various tasks on the ranch, fixing fences, watering trees, cutting weeds. This day-to-day work was done when I got home from school. In the fall, I often picked apples and loaded them into the back of my grandfather's pickup truck so that my family could sell them at nearby flea markets on the weekend for extra income. I remember my grandfather Manuel, who spoke Spanish and was known for his musical ability, as well as being a public speaker among his family and as a deacon of his church. He would often be up in the tree passing bushels of apples down the ladder for me to load onto the truck. We'd often come to Albuquerque and sell them at the flea market that was on Coors, just right above Foothill. That's where I spent lots of weekends among the flea market vendors, and so I grew up primarily as what linguists call a passive bilingual. I grew up around both languages, but only English was promoted as the dominant promoted by the dominant culture in the schools in which I learned how to read and write. We had a significant exposure to Spanish, the Spanish language, and with excellent comprehension by young adults in the 1990s. A lot of my classmates weren't expected to perform Spanish aside from maybe knowing a lot of popular songs that were on the radio. And so what I would later come into life to understand is that one is not born being able to speak. One becomes a speaker through public performance, through acts which affirm collective agency. By 15, 16, I was sent by my family to the annual Limpia, or community cleaning of the Acequia. My first job as a young man in our neighborhood, the Limpia, or Saca as it is called in other Acequia communities, involves participation of each of the Parciantes or Acequia members. On a crisp early morning, the sun has not yet come out from behind the Sangre de Cristo mountains to the east. My father drives in his truck to a place where there is access to the local Acequia. My father often nostalgically relates his experience of having worked on the Limpia of the Acequia prior to the time when the community had built a concrete main headgate. Often the young boys would have to wade in the river and bring stones to create a natural stone diversion. And often, later on in his life, they said they would bring wrecked cars. So it was, in many ways, these kind of ingenious ways of creating, infrastructure with doing without. It's like what they say, hacer de tripas corazón. You create the silk the silk purse out of the sosier. And so, so after arriving, we park our vehicle, and others are already there, and making sure not to park in the clearing in the center, thus allowing people to gather in that space. There are already 10 people gathered, mostly male, who make up the day. It's an intergenerational group of young boys, often 15 years and older like me, to elderly men. I button my jacket to keep warm. It's about 6:30 in the morning on a mid-March day, with 50 or so men and less than and some women ranging in about 15 to 60s, standing in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, talking in hushed tones in Spanish. Some with one hand in the pocket and others holding a shovel. One of the older men in the gathering takes out his file and demonstrates to others how having a clean and sharp shovel makes the work easier. He says, "You have to be mentally sharp like your shovel. Hay que ser abusado como esta pala para trabajar la acequia." In other words, this work is not for dummies. The sun peeks its head out from behind the mountains. The mardomo, who is the only permanent employee of the community, is getting his papers in order on a clipboard in his truck before the others gather. "Listos a trabajar, muchachos," to which the group offers a less enthusiastic response. A couple of anxious laughs here and there. Small conversations continue as the mardomo goes person to person with his list of parciantes. Or parciantes, which are irrigation members, and peones, or day laborers, who have reported for the day's work crew. The sun begins to create Resolanas. The people gather inconspicuously to warm up and talk to each other. Leaning on their shovels, the older men talk to one another as younger ones listen and whisper questions to their elders for clarification on what's going on. The mayordomo meets to the side with one of the 3 members of the comisión or commissioners who are democratically elected officials of La Acequia to discuss the work to be done that day. After that, the mayordomo addresses everyone generally to do roll call. One by one, he calls the parciantes' names. They are the peones who represent the parciantes. The ones that are there respond presente. There's about 70 parciantes in our acequia. After the roll call, the mayordomo goes over preliminary instructions for the group work and the individual tareas or work assignments, usually a section of the ditch that the peon has the responsibility of cleaning out within a few minutes. The crew walks to the acequia and forms a line inside the dry canal. The mayordomo, with a shovel, measuring out marks the first tareas, which are the work tasks, which are about usually 5 to 10 feet long of ditch canal. In my first year of participating in the Limpia, I was placed in the care of one of the older workers. With the person in front of me and the person behind me, we formed a cohort of mutual help that aided one another as the work progressed throughout the day. I was probably the most unskilled the first year. Being a greenhorn, I really didn't know how to efficiently use a shovel. The older workers modeled and instructed me through the informal 2 commands, explaining what I should do. Corta la barba, quita la baraña, endereza el bordo, saca las jaras, limpia las hojas, tira las piedras para allá. The domain of the Limpia is primarily 2 dialects of Spanish, Northern New Mexico heard from the local men, and Northern Mexican on the lips of younger immigrant laborers who were hired out by the parciantes. The younger person is expected to listen attentively while not looking directly at the speaker and to reflect on what's being said. About 10 minutes of work on the first tarea, the mayordomo who's walking either along the top of the ditch or among the workers shouts, "Vuelta!" to signal the workers to turn and change positions, to either move forward or cycle to the next section of the acequia to be cleaned. The signal is often to stop work while people in line walk down the acequia to other parts to be cleaned. Once we were there, the mayordomo or the designated rayador or measurer marks off the new tarea. Once the measurement is done, the peons begin again. Work with their shovel is to cut weeds, overgrowth, sometimes dead animals, picking up trash. Once the peones are finished with their own tareas, they often help their neighbors get their section done before the mayordomo calls out vuelta. This practice has various implications. First, it helps the less skilled individual have equity among his peers. Next, it allows the group to finish their collective tarea sooner and allows them to take a short break from work. This sentiment is captured concisely in the local popular dicho saying, "Entre más manos, el trabajo es menos." With more hands working together, the task is easier to accomplish. This shows how mutual aid is a central part of the values of this kind of community work. In the idle brief moments during the break, peones shed jackets, sweaters, and reflect on what they have done, and often carefully finish off the work, cleaning out leaves, small rocks, leaving the irrigation canal immaculately clean. When the mayordomo sees that many of the workers are talking and not working, he quickly calls again, "Vuelta!" to repeat the process. By noontime, the workers break for lunch and return an hour later. Some go home to the homes of the parciantes who prepare food for them. Others bring their lunch. Others head to town to purchase fast food and a couple of beers. In the afternoon, the crews gain in solidarity as they work together. By the end of the day, it's time to share a moment of rest after a long day's work. Remembering my own experience, it was a time when one of my fellow workers shared my first cold beer with me. And so it was the most delicious thing ever. Even though I don't drink now in my later years, but I always remember that one beer, because it was a reward, So what I want to talk about is that acequia cleaning is often in this description is a predominantly male space, but as often this was a narrative that in a memory that was thought about that took place in the 1990s, and often today this scene is so much changed. Acequias are becoming more and more not a space of just men. It's largely integrated space of women's work, and often we often don't see women's work as it is sometimes, whether it be in the food production, in the food preparation for the workers, or sometimes often in a lot of the works that I'll talk about in a bit. I think I'll stop there for a bit. And what was really important in terms of thinking about acequias is that seeing how oftentimes I started this project with acequias. I have to thank one of my my mentor who is back there, Enrique Lamadere, who did a field school back in the 2000s, and I wasn't even enrolled in the class, but I was invited, and they went up to Mora, and Paula was talking about the history, about land grants issues, acequia issues, and we went out to the field to see the averjón that day, the snow peas, which were growing. And I said, this is what I want to write about. This is what I have. I want to do my project on, and so I have to thank that inspiration and that work in the schools. In doing that, I started a project that summer to do oral histories and personal narratives about the acequia, which was called it was a project called Pláticas de la Acequia, and so I interviewed a lot of the elders they made up the Salazar Acequia, and with that I created a radio program that was called Que Vivan las Acequias. I'm sorry, I got the title wrong. It was called Aguas Vida. Hearing those stories from the people that had worked the acequias for quite a bit of time called the attention to the local commission, and they asked my help. They said, "Well, you're a young person that's in university. Could you help us update our bylaws?" And one of the issues that they wanted to update their bylaws, there was a particular case that was pending at that time. It was the Richard Cook against the community of Hernandez, the Hernandez Acequia. It was a person that wanted to do a water transfer of about 50 acres to a development outside of the acequia. So to take piecemeal a lot of these acequias is basically to cut the life source out of them. No, it's to take what the main property which acequias are built upon, and so we were helped in that sense that NMA in those years, in the decade before that, had fought long and hard to in 2003 to create two statutes, which gave the first statute gave acequias the say on basically you had to hold a trial. You had to have within the community, the acequia had to make the decision whether that transfer would be a detriment to the community. The second statute during the 2003 that was important also was the formation of water banks. And so a lot of times acequias were seeing the threat from the state engineer that a lot of water was going to be condemned due to non-use. And so the water bank allowed individual acequias to create a protection. It's almost that they would be able to hold the water rights that were not being used and disperse them in other places in that same system. And often it gets confused with the water banks that these water brokers have. But the water bank in the acequia in the 2003 statute created a really important power for local community to make decisions about their water use and where water was going to be. And right now I'd like to invite Paula García, because this is where in history where I met up, I'd met Paula, but she asked me, I had made some connections with, I was looking at the work of La Academia de la Nueva Raza, and I knew a lot of those people because I had often played music, and I often did a lot of translation and digital transfer work for various people of La Academia prior to that. And she said, well, would you be interested in coming on as a community, what was the title at the time? Community, it was a governance and community engagement specialist, no? And so at that time, she said we needed that the New Mexico Acequia Association had been doing lots of great work, but there was really a renewed interest to build better communication between the different acequia leaders. And often the times, one of the things that was being seen was a lot of the acequia leaders who were growing older. And how were we going to transmit that knowledge that the older leaders had to a younger generation that had a vested interest, that were family members, that were creating community, growing food. And so I'd like to invite Paula to talk about what happened. There was the creation of a new mode of engagement for NMAA, which was called La Escuelita de Las Acequias. And thank you, Paula, for coming and talking with us.
Thank you so much, David. Muchísimas gracias. Buenas tardes, desde Dios a todos. My name is Paula García, and I want to thank David for the invitation to be here. And I think I want to start by showing gratitude for David. I was having a conversation with my sister one time, and I got to thinking that I think David was an answer to our prayers, because we were saying, we really need a musician who can capture the spirit of our land and water movement in New Mexico. And I had for many years admired the musicians of other social justice movements and liberation movements, especially in Latin America, and thinking like, who's our Mercedes Sosa, or who's our Victor Jara here? And within a few years, got to know David, and we actually share the same lineage. We're both García de Noriega, and that's another story. And we've been working together. It's a beautiful working relationship. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to work with you, David.
Thank you, Paula. One of the things I wanted to kind of add before we start, in terms of talking about the Escuelita, in terms of how it's a dialogue, is how forms of communication are so important in terms of how we look at as even in terms of how neighbors talk to each other, how commissioners need to have various forms of communication between them and their parciantes. The commissioners themselves need to have very formalized relationships with their legislators. It's not just communication at a very static level, but it's a communication that is on a spectrum, and it's a very difficult spectrum, and it's a space where there's a lot of language dynamics that are occurring in these spaces. And I want to start off talking about, Esteban Arellano had this saying. He said, "Nuestra lengua es una lengua con mucha sabiduría. Es lo mismo que digo de las acequias. Se están destruyendo porque perdimos la lengua. Y en eso perdimos la sabiduría del ambiente." And this was a really important point, because I often think he's not just talking about Spanish. He's talking about an understanding about, having the language skills to be able to communicate and actually develop, new language, and whether that be, we'll talk at the end of this talk. I know we only have about 15 minutes left. Is it all right if we go a little bit, 15 more minutes? Okay. Is that one of the things was important is that La Academia they really looked at the importance of the acequia. Often they would take the term a dicho that was often said, a la acequia o a la escuela. And it was a value judgment that in the 1960s that was common, that people didn't value what they had in their own community. And so academia flipped that notion. They said, it was Esteban Arellano. I'll send around a kind of an artifact, which is a lot of this, work was not just oral. It was based a lot of times in print publications. No, Arellano wrote a journal that was called El Caminante, and right on the a la acequia y a la escuela, and so it was a radical departure. I'll send this around. A departure from, it was a reaffirmation of community knowledge, a radical affirmation of the subjugated knowledges within our communities, that the knowledge of what was going to be healthy for our communities was not solely in the books, but we had to look at ways of literacy to understand how to move a shovel through a field. That was another form of literacy. How to be able to talk to your parciantes, to your community members. That was another form of literacy. How to do print journalism. So they were in many ways looking at literacy, not beyond the form of the book, beyond just the paper, but in terms of how literacy created community, and through forms of dialogue in Resolana.
Thank you, David. We have many of the same mentors from the Academia de la Nueva Raza. Mine being more from, my mentorship came more from Antonio Medina and Facundo Valdez, who were both mostly community health workers, and their involvement in the academia was very much around affirming our culture, our traditional knowledge, our language, and that extended to the acequia. I became involved with the acequias not so much through the cultural immersion of growing up on an acequia in the way that David did. I grew up on a rancho in Mora, but not on an acequia. And my first exposure to the world of acequias in the way that we're working now was more the political side of water. And as a student activist, I was involved with the Southwest Organizing Project, and they were protesting water rights that are being transferred to Intel. And what was the key to that protest was an acequia that was protesting that water. At the same time, my mentor, Antonio Medina, in Mora, was protesting a water transfer out of the Acequia del Norte, which we're now part of, my son and I, where he cleans the acequia. And I went to my first cleaning, and the mardomo told me, "No, tú nomás vales medio peón," he told me. Pero vente a limpiar, ponte a trabajar. So I'm a half a peón, and I'm proud. But and my son makes up for it because he's más carrudo que los otros. So it's good. And so I got involved in the acequias more through activism, through community activism. And I was very blessed to be part of a service learning project that Antonio Medina and Tomás Atencio, Facundo Valdez, and others put together through a community organization called Siete del Norte. And they had a service learning project where we were sent home to work. It was like a domestic Peace Corps. It was an AmeriCorps project. And instead of going to a third world country and working in service, you were encouraged to go home to your community and be of service. And it was a really valuable experience for me because I had the opportunity to work with a wonderful group of elders. But at the time, I didn't understand the full importance of la Academia de la Nueva Raza in the way that I did later. But looking back, it was a profound influence on me. And so years later, I became part of the New Mexico Acequia Association. I started in 1998, and we were really, the organization I worked for grew out of the struggle. It was a political struggle to defend water. The acequias organized themselves mainly for legal defense, and this is all documented very well in Dr. Jose Rivera's books. And it was about defending water rights legally mainly through adjudication, and this was all thrust upon the people. Imagine being in the 60s, an elder getting a piece in the mail saying, you know, you're a defendant in a lawsuit, and listed every viejito starting from A to Z in the adjudication. So for decades, that was going on since the 60s. And that had formed what we knew as the Acequia leadership at the time was legal defense, legal struggle, proceedings, going to court, all of these things. And it kind of influenced the kind of leadership that was coming up into these positions like mardomos, commissioners, regional associations of acequias for legal defense. And when I started in the 90s, these leaders had been at it for decades already. And elders, people in their 70s and 80s who had been fighting for 30, 40 years. And we were also very immersed in legal defense against water transfers, which, as David explained, anytime there's a transfer of water out of an acequia, it contributes to the piecemeal dismantling of that acequia. And the commodification of water was really starting to, accelerate in the 80s and 90s, and that's when you saw the acequia movement start to coalesce around this concept of protecting water as a community resource. So in the late 90s, when I came on board, the focus at that time was protecting water rights, legal defense, still very much in defense mode. And that's around the time that David explained that we were focused on changing laws at the state legislature. And so we had enough of a critical mass. We built a grassroots membership organization around the state, and then passed some laws, strengthened our governance. And then upon reflection, so those laws were passed in 2003, we did this big organizing effort around the state to update hundreds of bylaws. Hundreds. I mean, we've done about 500 sets of bylaws. Imagine there's about 700 in the state, so we are still lacking some. And that was a huge organizing effort. And then in the late 2000s probably, and David's talking about how our leadership started to rethink our priorities. And we said, you know, it's good, the legislation's good, the policy work is good, the mobilization's important, but we need to take a step back and look at how are we really building the movement? How are we engaging whole families and whole communities and women leaders and young leaders? And we started different projects, Sembrando Semillas, to involve youth. And eventually we started Escuelita de Las Acequias to create that space in a different way. So we weren't always talking about laws and being on the defensive, and really take a step back and focus on what's important in our culture, how we're passing on the worldview. And I learned very early on in the struggle against water transfers that we still have a worldview that's different. The worldview of water as a community resource as opposed to water just being a commodity that can be bought and sold. And that was something that we wanted to elevate and pass on in as a cultural lifeway. So the Escuelita de Las Acequias came out of that reflection in our leadership, and it really had a very strong influence from the concept of that was articulated by David from Esteban Arellano, that it was a false choice that you had to either go dig ditches or go to school. I know when I was going to school, if you were misbehaving in class, they would say, you better pórtate bien, or you're going to end up digging ditches. Like, it was a stigma. If you stayed home in your village and became a farmer, it was a stigma when I was growing up. Like, go somewhere and find work, but don't stay here. And the whole idea of a la acequia y a la escuela, meaning that there's a lot of learning here, and affirming that we have a very precious knowledge base in our communities, and that we need to continue that. So the Escuelita de Las Acequias was created around the idea that we wanted to affirm that knowledge. And I want to recognize some members of our Escuelita here. We have Lorenzo and Dora, who have been longtime participants, as well as Patrick and Elise, who are both here as well. And so the Escuelita, the first one we did was with the consultation and blessing of people from La Academia, that Antonio Medina, Tomás Atencio, and Consuelo Pacheco, and Facundo Valdez, Esteban Ariano, and Alejandro Lopez.
And then later Juanita was part of it.
Juanita Lavadi también, yeah. So it was what we were wanting to do was create a lineage from La Academia to the Escuelita de Las Acequias as a methodology for community organizing, for learning, for building a movement. And the Escuelita de Las Acequias was largely influenced by David. We first started thinking about Escuelas de las Acequias, and some of us were very, and my staff were mostly women, and so when we started thinking of the concept, it was largely influenced by the escuelas of the Zapatistas, which are very women-led, if you've seen that in the Zapatista movement. And sort of like, we need escuelas for the acequias, and then in talking to David, it evolved into Escuelita, kind of reflecting the way we look at things as manitos, always making everything little, like the chilito, papitas.
It's like an honorific. No?
Honorific.
It's that it's an important space. No? It's an affirming that also that the escuelita is not the building, but the escuelita is the community that it's the learning community.
It's and the space that can happen in the process. It's more of a process as opposed to a solid structure, I guess you could say. So I'm not going to go to all these slides, but David, these are like 4 years old, so they haven't been updated. But the concept is that we have an escuelita cohort that goes through 3 encuentros, and in each encuentro we create the space of a Resolana. The learning is in a circle. And in the circle, we affirm that everyone's a teacher, everyone's a student, and everyone contributes valuable knowledge. And they're intergenerational, so we cultivate intergenerational leadership in the circle through Praxis, what Tomás Atencio would call the circle of thought and action. And so our model is to ground ourselves in shared values, do shared analysis, shared work, and then shared reflection. And we use acequia metaphors for every step of the way. But mostly it's centered around core values of love and respect. And in our work that we can create collectively intention to stay close to our roots of love, respect, and family through different aspects of our community: governance, spirituality, land and water. And so there's different ways that we do that. We also learned from working in policy advocacy that you can't legislate love and respect, that there has to be a cultural underpinning to all of our work. You can't just convince people never to sell their water unless they have a deep cultural attachment and a deep love for that water being and remaining connected to the community. So the movement had to be rooted in culture as opposed to only political analysis and changing laws and changing policies. But our work is focused in 2 ways: these encuentros, where we have the Resolana space created, and then tarea. And tarea comes from the acequia cleaning, the concept of everybody has a piece of the work, and that we do it all collectively. And it's very simple. It's about being open to learning from others and affirming that everyone has knowledge.
And so I want to talk about it's the other things that we often do in the Escuelita is role play. Is that a lot of times we have elders that have gone to the lobby for their acequia, but how do we get the younger people? So it was oftentimes pairing an established leader with a younger leader from their community, but often sometimes from another community. And one of the important things about this was that how do we get those younger people to have the skills and also the body of knowledge that the elders have when they do have the opportunity to go talk to their legislators? What will be their talking points? What will be, and so oftentimes we would have these, what we call kind of based upon the Teatro Campesino and the actos, is that Or what would one of the situations of one of the actos would be is what are reasons that an acequia parciante would sell their farm, or one of the things we did recently was how do you challenge a proposed bill that was going to a proposed bill that would be detrimental to the acequia, and that was a really fun practice because it gave people the opportunity to be basically at the legislature, but in a safe space that allowed for laughing, allowed for learning, that was not necessarily a space that that where a lot of the anxiety of being in those very formal spaces could occur. And one of the things that's really important is that in addition to one of the imaginaries that we have in growing with the acequia movement is to inspire these leaders, elders and younger leaders, is that who's their base? How do you grow that it's not just one person on acequia that's going to carry all the load? As I said earlier, entre más el trabajo es menos, no? So with that, a lot of these dichos and this, they say como los dichos son los evangelitos chiquitos, no? They kind of in many ways distill like the knowledge that is shared between elders and in many ways. One of the important things is that imaginary of having a base of 800 people, and oftentimes 800 just comes from a song. How this directly relates to music comes from the song of Valentín de la Sierra. Valentín de la Sierra, one of the things that Facundo Valdés and Antonio Medina would often bring up those two versos that come from that corrido. El coronel le decía, ¿cuál es la gente que guías? Son 800 soldados que trae por la Sierra Mariano Mejía. And so it's that sense of leadership is who is your community? And that's a really important question, is that not who you speak for, who says that you're their leader. And that's a really important point about recognition, about leadership. It's not just saying, well, I'm an activist and I do work in this, but does your community recognize you as he's a person that we want to go represent us? And so it's really important that the sense that growing that base, the 800 soldados, taking something from from the ballad tradition, is a lot of the poetics of songs, the poetics of stories, of ways that people talk, become really an anchor for people to build knowledge upon. That it's not just simply a cultural text that tells a story about Valentín, who was a cristero, but it reimagines that idea of that corrido in New Mexico today, and it gives a sense of inspiration for a leader to come out of that, using that text as a cultural icon, no? So.
One of the things that we'll do in an encuentro, and we're all sitting around the circle, is towards the end of the encuentro, we'll sing the corrido and create our own versos with the words that are unique to each person, and it elevates that person as the leader of a place, and I think that's something that's really critical to do in movement building, is for people to embrace that concept of being a leader, not a leader in the sense of speaking for people, but that you're honored to have people that listen to you, and that you have their blessing to go and represent them in a political space, and that's what we need. And so the Escuelita has been really instrumental in building the base that we use to mobilize for trying to affect the geopolitics of water in New Mexico. And we were able to mobilize 300 plus for Acequia Day at the legislature. Our Congreso generates hundreds of people as well to come together around defining our priorities. But every time we gather, it's a cultural space. It's a place of seeing your friends, of sharing a good meal, always music. In fact, if we're going to have anything, the first person we call is David. Because if we have the Canción de las Acequias, okay, it's a party. It's on. We're doing it. Whether it be Acequia Day or a meeting with the governor, which we had earlier this week. Whatever it is, that we create that spirit. And that's the Escuelita helped us cultivate that leadership base. And I'll just kind of end with one more slide, if that's okay.
This one's a really good one because it also shows the kind of the center core of these encuentros, which is in the top slide. We often have a space. People initially were thinking about what would be a focal point for these encuentros, and often we thought about the things that the acequia leads to in terms of this cultural transformation from land to table. Is that the work of that happens at the kitchen table is such an important metaphor for the work that we do. Is that as I always think about Joy Harjo. She says our lives begin and end at the kitchen table, because often in her communities they would often bring the person that they were having awake. They would lay the body on the kitchen table, but this is often the space where you bring the things that are most important to you. And a lot of times people would bring shovels. And Paula can also talk about this, is that each encuentro had a different theme for the mesa. The mesa, sometimes it was talking about mesa. The first one was talking about the banquet, things we share with each other. Other mesas have been La cosecha. And people bring a particular item. It's kind of like show and tell, but show and tell that is directly tied to acequia, and it gives the opportunity for people to tell their story and share their knowledge in communication with other people. And often it's a cathartic space. Oftentimes people are crying in that space, and it's a place where we can build relationships and build community, where we can share the joys and the challenges around that space. So,
yeah, I think to close up my part, I just want to talk a little bit about the storytelling aspect of the Escuelita and providing the space for everyone's voice to be expressed, and instilling a sense of respect for the person who's telling the story, and being good listeners, and also the aspect of shared work in the tarea. So there's a service learning aspect where everybody commits to a project. We have 3 encuentros. So between the encuentros, people are out implementing a project, and then they come back and tell the story about it. So by the end of the year, people have a story about the work that they did, about their tarea, and then we publish a cuaderno de tarea at the end of the Escuelita cohort. So there's one here.
We'll pass it around.
Yeah, and so the result is a group of leaders with a strong collective identity, and this is something that's very critical to our second movement right now. Thank you, David. I'll go ahead and turn it back.
Well, we're gonna thank you so much.
On that note, the talking is awesome, but we have some time for Q&A, so please, if anybody has questions for either Dr. Garcia or Paulo Garcia.
Just David.
Okay. Anyway, if anybody has questions for either of them, please. Yes,
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I just recently watched the movie The Panther,
The which one?
and I was surprised at what you're saying here. Very much is brought out in this film. The core values of love, honesty, community, and family, and some of the things of fighting for the community. And I was amazed how what you're talking about here is being shown now in film. Not all films, but in this particular movie.
Which movie was it?
Panther?
Panther.
Panther.
Oh,
The
look at it.
Black Panther or the Panther.
Black
I love that.
Oh.
We'll have to go see it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, Black Panther. All right.
Yeah.
Panther.
Yeah. You
keep talking. I know you're from Mora and you're from García, but how does this work across other communities in northern New Mexico? How are you connecting from, let's say, the Tierra Maria area to the San Miguel area to Taos area, etc.?
So NMA has identified various leaders in a lot of the different watersheds. And with their work through doing various workshops in a lot of these communities, they've done workshops doing, in terms of governance, governance workshops, legal workshops, workshops dealing with anything under the sun. You can think of that acequias, they're dealing with acequias. So they know a lot of the people out there. And so a lot of the leaders that that were initially thought of that were brought in were recruited from these. Sometimes they were acequia commissioners, sometimes they were, and Paula can talk a little bit more about the section because I was there for about 2 years, but then there was even more people that were that kind of that circle of different watersheds. The leaders were drawn from different places other than watersheds.
Yeah, we're a statewide organization, and many of the acequias are organized by watershed into what we call regional associations, and most of them came together around legal defense and adjudication, and others have come together around an organizing campaign of some type. So there's actually two here in the Middle Rio Grande. One is the South Valley Regional Association of Acequias, and there's one in the North Valley as well, and Enrique La Madrid is one of our delegates. And that's how we met Lorenzo and Dora, is through the South Valley Regional Association. So we put a call out to our leadership, and we say we want 1 or 2 people from each of the regions around the state, and we put them all together in a room, and it's like 50 people. And that's what the circle is comprised of. But we try to do it intergenerationally, so we're asking people, bring a young person, or bring your spouse, or bring something to diversify. Because in years past, the commissioners mayordomos tended to be mostly older men, and we need that cohort of leadership, absolutely, and we honor all of that leadership that's been given to the movement, and at the same time we want to bring in more people. So you don't have to be a commissioner to be an acequia leader, or you could be a young person, and you could be anybody that has a voice that can inspire people.
And also, I was going to add to that was that NMA, apart from the Escuelita de Las Acequias, is one of the aspects of NMA. NMA also has a representative body, which brings in a lot of leaders from different places, and so it almost models democratic representation. We have Carol. She joined us to sing this year at the Congreso de las Acequias, which happens annually, and it's a space where lots of this interest group of acequias is really important, and you have people there from people that are interested in food justice to people that are in Washington that come to hear about these issues, and often it's a politically charged space, and often you feel like in those spaces that it's easy to go to the legislature because after you've been in those spaces, it models what you need to do to so.
Anybody? Yes, Enrique.
Yeah, just a brief comment. There used to be a really great declaration on the NMAA webpage it was like a declaration for
Food sovereignty.
Acequia allies.
Oh yeah.
And I'd really like to take another look at that because I get hit all the time with questions from people that they say, and these were all gathered together in a book of comments on the exhibits that have happened in the past. And they say, well, this is really great. Well done, you guys. But not everybody has the great blessing of living next to an acequia. And how do acequias benefit everyone? And that list of points was such a great document to show people and to convince them that local water management by the people that benefit from that water unites us with really the rest of the world. That there are many beneficiaries of the NMAA that that have to get their water out of a hose, you know, and just convincing them that this is important work is a vital task.
I know exactly what you're talking about. And yeah, in 2006, and we've had like these incremental steps of movement building, and one of the biggest parts of building a movement is articulating values and, you know, putting it down and having a marker in history. So I feel like we're, you know, making history, and sometimes we just keep moving and forget that we did that one action. But that was in 2006, and it was part of the Aguas Vida Declaration. And so we had an Aguas Vida Declaration, then we had a Allies Declaration, and I'll find that for you. But we should definitely use that as a tool for building support.
Another one? No? Nothing? All right. So thank you guys very much for presenting today.
As el difunto Facundo Valdez says, it's not a meeting until we start off with song and we end with song. And so I'm going to share with this is a song that I wrote on the back. There, on the front was the Canción de las Acequias. Oh, here's a copy. On the back is a song it's called Que Nunca Se Olvida, which a lot of times these words were things that I heard in the encuentros. One of them particularly always gets to me is Delbert Trujillo said, told us this story. He said, the most important thing that I bring to the mesa today is my hat, is because my hat represents everything inside the hat brim is the sweat of my brow. And he said, the sweat of my brow is also water. And that water is just like the acequia. And so it says, mi sangre, el sudor de mi frente, mi sangre refinada, procede de esa agua que fluye en la acequia. And another one was, all these different versos, they came out of experience of hearing the stories of a lot of the people that shared stuff out of the, and often the kind of the imagined space that we affirm what water is. Water's life, but it's one of the most powerful affirmations we have in the Spanish language is the viva. And so when we say viva, we got to make sure that it's an important thing we say viva too. A lot of times it's often in our communities it's for weddings. It's often for saints' days they affirm the patron saints. Someone that's a really important leader in the community, they'll say que viva. And we always have to keep that in mind, that the viva is literally affirming the life of that thing, that it continues. And so when we say que vivan las acequias, it's not just saying we're having a party, having the acequias. It says literally we want to affirm that this continues. And so this goes like this. If you can help me clap. Que vivan las acequias, que vivan nuestros ríos, que vivan los paseantes de la comunidad. Que vivan las acequias, que vivan nuestros ríos, que vivan los paseantes de la comunidad. Con cavador en mano ayudaré a mi hermano, igual a mi hermana en mutualidad. Con cavador en mano yo ayudaré a mi hermano, también a mi hermana en mutualidad. Que vivan las acequias, que vivan nuestros ríos, que vivan los parciantes de la comunidad. Que vivan las acequias, que vivan nuestros ríos, que vivan los parciantes de la comunidad. Thank you so much. Que vivan las acequias.